Welcome to the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Rosensweet, mom of 3 young people, peaceful parenting coach, and your cheerleader and guide on all things parenting. Each week, we'll cover the tools, strategies, and support you need to end the yelling and power struggles and encourage your kids to listen and cooperate so that you can enjoy your family time. I'm happy to say we have a great relationship with our 3 kids. The teen years have been easy and joyful, not because we're special unicorns, but because my kids were raised with peaceful parenting. I've also helped so many parents just like you stop struggling and enjoy their kids again. I'm excited to be here with you today and bring you the insight and information you need to make your parenting journey a little more peaceful. Let's dive into this week's conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. If you are a regular listener to the podcast, you know that at the end of every guest expert interview, I ask them if they could go back in time and give advice to their younger parent self. What advice would they give themselves? And there are so many gems of wisdom that come from that question that I thought it would be fun to end 2024 with a bit of a mashup of all of the advice from our guests of 2024 and what they would go back in time and tell their younger parent selves. This is the last episode in 2024. We'll be back in January with another season of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. If you have any great ideas for guests, make sure to reach out to me and give me your ideas of experts you'd like to hear come on the podcast. If you would like to be on the podcast as a parent, getting some parent coaching, also reach out to me and we can discuss the details. Best way to get in touch with me is either DM me on Facebook or on Instagram or send me an email, sarah@sararosensweet.com. In January, we're going to kick off the season with an interview with my daughter Maxine about what it was like to be raised with peaceful parenting. She is now in grade 12, or a senior as you call it, in the United States. And she's my last kid at home. She has a lot of opinions about it, and I thought it would be fun for you to hear her perspective. So if you have anything that you want me to ask Maxine, also be sure to reach out. Again, DM me on Instagram or on Facebook, or send me an email, sarah@sararosensweet.com, with any ideas for experts, with your interest in coaching, coming on the podcast to get some free parent coaching, or anything you want to know from Maxine about what it was like to be raised with peaceful parenting. So let's go ahead and meet our first guest. Our first guest of the year was Casey Ehrlich, who is a parenting coach who specializes in supporting parents who are parenting PDA children. PDA is pathological demand avoidance, and it's a flavor of autism. So let's go ahead and hear what Casey has to say. I'm just going to ask you my last question, which is what I ask all my podcast guests, which is if you could go back in time to your new parent self, what advice would you give yourself? It could be to do with anything.
Move back to Michigan earlier and don't worry about your career because you're going to need a lot more help than you thought. No, that would have been too triggering for my new mom self. I think just maybe your life is going to look so much different than you thought it would. And the birth of this child is going to change everything about it, but it's actually going to turn out in a way that's healing and that you never expected. So trust your intuition and lean into the hard and the grief, and you will come out on the other side.
Thank you.
And there's good stuff there on the other side. It's just going to take time.
What a wonderful thing to keep in mind, especially if you as a parent are dealing with some challenging things or challenging situation right now. If you want to listen to the rest of Casey's episode, that was episode 139. Okay, our next guest is Mary Van Geffen, who specializes in parenting spicy ones. Her episode is number 138. My last question for you, a question I ask all my guests. If you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
I guess I would remind her to invest in her friendships with other moms, but also with folks that are on a different journey than her. And that a big part of your life is the quality of your relationships. And the children really are just home. I mean, depending on their capabilities, but about 19 years. And towards the end of that, they're busy. So really creating a life beyond your children.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Creating a life beyond my children. I think that's where I am at right now. That actually reminds me of one of our earlier episodes with Eve Rodsky, who wrote a book called Finding Your Unicorn Space. She was on episode 30, and she talked about the importance of us having things in our lives that are not self-care, that are not our duties at work or at home, but are really the things that we're interested in. And I think she said something like, you have to be interested in your own life. And I thought that was really cool. So definitely check out episode 30 if that resonates with you. Creating a life beyond our children. I love that. Our next piece of advice is from Kyle Wester, who's actually a parenting coach who trained with me with Dr. Laura Markham. His episode is number 141, if you want to give that a listen. And he's a dad who peaceful parenting was not natural for him or easy for him. And he used his journey to help other parents who are on the same peaceful parenting journey. Let's hear what Kyle has to say. And the last question I'll ask you is one I ask all my guests, which is if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Man, I think the one I'd want to say is, to really be more intentional about the anger. I really want to go back, and I think I'm much better now, but even early on, I guess that's what it took a while to learn. That's as I'm reflecting on it, is there was so much shame associated with my anger, and that kept me trapped for a couple of years until eventually I stopped beating myself up about not being a perfect parent. Because Sarah, in the work we're in, there's a lot of pressure. And so I would constantly be like, Kyle, you're blowing up in a way you not to adapt to, right? And so to forgive myself quicker, to let that shame go away quicker, so then I could really just grow and build a better connection with my kids, even when I screw up. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've been doing over the past 4 or 5 years, is every screw up is an opportunity for me to actually become closer to my kids, because they know I don't expect myself to be perfect, and nor do I expect them to be perfect.
Thanks, Kyle. I think that's something that we all need to remember. If you've followed me for a while, you've often heard me say that you're never going to be able to be a, quote, successful, peaceful parent if you beat yourself up. The only way to do this work is to be kind and compassionate with ourselves when we mess up. And we are going to mess up because we're human and because what we're doing is really hard. And the only way to make any progress is to talk to yourself like your best friend, like you would talk to your best friend, and be kind and compassionate with yourself even when you mess up. And the thing is, you don't need to worry that you're going to let yourself off the hook if you beat yourself up. You don't need to worry that you're going to let yourself off the hook if you stop beating yourself up, because this is so important to you, right? This is so important to you that you can be kind to yourself and still strive to do better when you mess up. Again, Kyle was episode 141, if you want to hear that. Next, we're going to hear from Stephanie Pinto. Stephanie Pinto is a fellow parenting coach over in Australia. This episode was fun because this was us interviewing each other for each other's podcasts. So not only are you going to hear Stephanie's advice to her younger self, but you're going to hear my advice to my younger self. If you could go back to your earlier parent self, go back in your little time machine, what advice would you give yourself?
I should have been prepared because I know you asked this. You know what, to my younger parent self, I think I would have said, slow down and stop and listen to what your emotions are telling you. Because as I said before, oh my gosh, there are wealth of information and they are so rich and they enrich our lives. They can make it really tough, or they can make it ecstatic and joyful and bring us closer with people. But I was so good at putting them away in service of, what does the person in front of me think, and what are they saying, and what should I feel? How should I respond? How should I show up based on them? Like I said, I was a good people pleaser. Mm-hmm. So I think my advice would be just slow down and just tune in and listen to what your emotions are telling you, right? Mm-hmm. Be gentle with yourself.
Nice.
Can I answer that too?
Yeah, sure. I was going to say maybe I should answer it. I've never answered it in the 3 years I've had my podcast.
Okay, I'm going to ask
It's a little bit. Okay, you go ahead and ask me.
Okay, so what advice would you give, Sarah, to if you think back to when you were first time parent or early parent of your young three, what advice would you give to yourself? I'm going to say two things. One of them's silly, but have a fourth child.
Yeah, I think so. I wish we had, but it's just that ship has totally sailed. But maybe not really. But my real advice was something that I actually did realize, but not until my kids had been getting a little bit older. I was always waiting for the future, like when they're sleeping through the night, when they're in school, when we have more money, I always had this like future point where I thought things will be easier then or things will be better then. Like I always had this idea, like now feels hard and it'll be better when, right? And I remember I was listening to the radio one day and there was this like news story on where this woman was talking, maybe it wasn't a news story, it was something I heard on the radio. This woman was talking about how she and her kids had been at the gas station and they just pulled away from the pumps and the pumps blew up. Like, and they had narrowly like 30 seconds earlier and their car would have blown up if they hadn't left. And I heard that. And for some reason, like, I just got this like really strong feeling of like, oh my God, like today could be your last day on earth. So what meant to me was like, this is it. Like I suddenly had this strong feeling of like, today is it. This is it. Like, this is it. And actually a girlfriend of mine gave me a t-shirt she had printed on it. This is it. Cause I had shared that idea with her. So I used to have a t-shirt that said, this is it, that I wore a lot when my kids were little. But I just started to try and think about like, if today was your last day on earth, like what would you find to appreciate about today? And so that, I wish I'd known that earlier because I feel like I spent a lot of time thinking about things will be better when, instead of just thinking like, today's imperfect, today's hard, but what can you find to like about today?
Wow. Oh, well, that blows my answer out of the water.
It doesn't at all.
That is so profound, though. That's beautiful. Yeah. If not only now, we have today. And what do you want to find joyful about today? I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people in my community have kids that are not super easy and the days are really hard. They are hard. But even if you can just, okay, this is it. Today's the day. And yes, maybe things will get easier in the future. But what can you find about today that you can find even some small thing? That was funny to hear myself. I still would give the same advice to my younger self. And I'd forgotten that I said I would have had a fourth child. I probably would have. And it definitely is too late for that. Again, that was Stephanie Pinto and myself talking on her podcast and my podcast. And that was episode 144. If you want to go back and listen to the rest, Stephanie talked a lot about emotional intelligence. That's her specialty. So that was an interesting conversation. The next guest that we're going to hear from is my dear friend, Sonali Vongchusiri. And she really is a friend that I've made several good friends through parent coaching, and Sonali's one of them. She's really wonderful. She lives in Thailand and she has 3 kids. And she has been on the podcast a couple of times. And this time she came back and talked about her experience being different. She has albinism and she's visually impaired. And she talked about the support that she would have liked to have gotten as she was growing up and how we can support our kids who are different. Let's hear what she had to say to her younger parent self. But if you had a time machine and you could go back to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
I think based on the conversation that we've had today, I would tell her that it is okay for her to be exactly where she is. And that it is okay for her to let herself be her. And that's interesting. And getting caught up on this question today. I think because we've talked about so many different things, I would want her to know that her kids being her kids are going to hold such deep spaces for her to step into. And that through the path of parenting and because of her commitment to her kids, that she's going to find herself. I think that comes into the self-esteem thing. I think we can have self-esteem when we know who we are and we allow ourselves to have an identity and we allow ourselves to have needs. That's what I would tell her, is that it's okay for her to have needs. And it's okay for her to do it differently. And that she can actually enjoy doing it differently.
So wise, Sonali, so wise. That was episode 146, if you want to go back and listen to it. Our next piece of wisdom is from Dr. Megan Anna Neff. She is a clinical psychologist who is neurodivergent and specializes in supporting neurodivergent people, including parents. So I'm going to ask you a question that I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
I love that question. Can I give her information?
You can give her anything you want.
Okay. Yeah. I would have, so I often say this, and I actually ask people this a lot, of like, what age would you have wanted to know about your neurodivergence? And I actually think I learned about my autism at the right age. But I wish I'd known about my children's. I wish I knew they were neurodivergent. There are so many moments that I would have just done so differently if I had known. And so I wish I could have injected that, and my own. That would have actually been helpful. But yeah, I just wish I could have injected information about the fact that here I was, neurodivergent, parenting two neurodivergent children. That would have helped immensely.
Yeah. Well, I guess we have to just forgive ourselves for all of the not knowing and things that we would have done differently if we had known.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That is literally one of the entries in the book, is forgive yourself. Because when you don't know, you don't know. Yeah. We have to forgive ourselves for our past.
Yeah. That comes up a lot with coaching parents and peaceful parenting, and they start to understand the effects of punishment and yelling and all of the things, and they feel so bad for having used conventional discipline for the first 5 years or whatever. And I say you have to forgive yourself for not knowing what you know now before you knew it.
Oh, I love that. I love that.
So good, Dr. Megan Anna. Her episode was number 147. She also has a great podcast called Divergent Conversations, if you are looking for an interesting podcast to listen to. It's not parenting related or not parenting specific, but it is really interesting if you're neurodivergent or you're interested in neurodivergence. Our next time machine wisdom is with Phyllis Fagell, who is an expert in middle schoolers. Oh my goodness, it's such a hard age. If you have a middle schooler or an up-and-coming middle schooler, you're definitely going to want to check out podcast number 151. I learned so much from Phyllis and from reading her book. By the way, we'll put a link to all of the books of our authors that we interviewed in the show notes. So check out the show notes. We'll put links to the podcast episodes also, as well as links to their books in the show notes. This is a question I ask all my podcast guests. If you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
That the range of normal is so broad that it is really hard. I think it's really hard for parents, especially when kids are babies and toddlers. Everything seems to be happening in lockstep. You sign up for the same mommy group or the same music class or the preschool that your friend's sending their kid to preschool. And then suddenly kids start to diverge a little bit. They have different interests, and it can be disconcerting to realize that your kid doesn't want to play soccer like the other kids, or maybe your kid needs OT or speech or whatever it is that's going on in their life. And what I would go back and tell myself is that it's okay. Everybody's on their own timeline and their own track. To quote the author of Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, I share in the book her graduation speech at my daughter's high school graduation. One of the things she talks about it is, first she said, there's no right track. And then she said, there's no track. And I think that's something I would go back and tell myself, there's no track. Everybody just moves at their own pace. And I was not a school counselor when my first child was born. That was a career change for me. And one of the gifts of being a school counselor in my own life is that I see every day that there are so many different ways to be a child, to be a teen, and that it's all okay, and that there's no one right social group. And the kids who seem to have it all together don't have it all together. And the kids who only have a couple of friends might be super happy and doing just fine. So being really careful not to impose our own assumptions on our kids.
Thanks. That is so valuable. Wow, I think the advice that everybody is on their own timeline and not to compare your children to other people's children is so important to remember, especially for those of you in our community who have kids who might not be typically developing or might be more complex and can take longer to develop, and for them to, what I could say, smooth out. So really, definitely keep this one in mind, to remember that everyone's on a different timeline and that there is no such thing as, quote, normal. Okay, next up we have Destini Davis, who is a wonderful conscious parenting coach and mom of 2. And she's going to share with us what she would have told her younger parent self.
There's a question that I ask all my podcast guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Okay. Definitely to be compassionate and intentional in my self-discipline, and be willing to get help and tools and resources that I need when things get challenging and difficult. It's a conversation I have with my 11-year-old now, where there's now kin and there's later kin. And I rebelled so much against my parenting that I experienced, because I feel like they were just always focused on the future, who I'm going to be in the future. And so I was like, no, it's just all instant gratification. I'm going to do what feels good. And I wish that I had the fortitude, but also the resources to be able to honor both versions of myself, like honor how I'm feeling right now, but also make intentional choices to prepare myself for the future.
I love that. I still struggle with now Sarah and next month Sarah.
Yeah.
And that's a reminder I could always use on now Sarah versus next month Sarah. If you want to hear Destini's episode, that was number 153. Our next piece of wisdom is from Ruth Whippman, who wrote a book called BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. This is even more important today than it was when I interviewed her earlier this year, as there is so much going on in the world today that I think comes from not giving boys and men enough nurturing. So let's hear what Ruth has to say. And as I mentioned before, we'll put a link to her book in the show notes. It's a really important one for all parents to read, especially parents of boys. If you want to have a listen to Ruth's episode, it is episode 155. I have a question that I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your new parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
That's a great question. Well, I think there's a lot of things. I think respond with more nurture rather than less. I think don't be so hard on myself. I think I saw everything as my fault, and I think that was harmful for me, and it didn't help the boys. So I think maybe more nurture for them and more nurture for myself, probably.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We've made it to Ned Johnson, who is another actual friend I've made in this space. What a side benefit it's been getting to know other parenting professionals and meeting them in real life and getting to know them. Ned has been on the podcast 3 times. His most recent episode was this one that he's talking from. He's one of my all-time favorite people to talk to. He's so engaging and interesting. And he did give the same advice this time as he did the first time he was on the podcast. So it's funny to think about. And there's another person that I didn't actually include in this mashup because his advice was the same advice as Ned's, Dr. Roberto Olivardia, one of my favorite interviews of the past year as well. Definitely go back and check that one out if you haven't heard it yet. It's all about having to feed kids in a different way when the division of responsibility doesn't work and intuitive feeding doesn't work. So that was Dr. Roberto Olivardia said the same thing as Ned. So this is for both of them. Oh, and Ned is one of the authors of The Self-Driven Child and his follow-up book. Well, his and his writing partner's follow-up book, What Do You Say? The Self-Driven Child is one of my top 3 parenting books, and I recommend it all the time. I'll just close by asking you the question that I ask all my guests. And I know you've answered it before, so I'm sure you don't remember your answer, but it'll be curious if you gave the same answer or not, because I remember what it was. If you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Right now, what's top of mind for me is I would have gotten more sleep.
That's the same thing you said last time. So
Is
you're
it really?
consistent. Yes.
Good. Yeah. Part of it, I stayed up late with friends last night, but it's raising kids is hard, right? If you're really doing it the way that you want to be doing, you put a ton of energy into it, right? And there are things you can't control. And well, I mean, the wonderful writer Lisa D'Amour says that sleep's the thing that it's the glue that holds us together, right? And so I do have friends, and my kid as well, people who can get along seemingly really well with not enough sleep. But most of us, well, at the very least, we are not going to be our best selves when we're tired and sleep deprived. And we don't have to be perfect, right? The kids don't need perfect parents, thank goodness. Because I think I shared before, the only perfect parents that I know are people who don't have children, right? And for the rest of us, right? So yeah, so I stick with that. And take the long view. Take the long view. I mean, if it's so hard, I mean, it's your first time having a 3-year-old, the first time having a 13-year-old, first time having, and when things go sideways, you're like, oh my goodness. And of course you're worried because you love your kid with all of your heart. And you start worrying they're going to be, right? But if you could take the long view and say, this is just part of their plan. I mean, sorry, part of their path. It's not in its plan, but this is where it is. I have friends who are in town and was telling them about my misadventure, my parents, and they just shook their head and they say, I'm so sorry. And I said, listen, my parents did the best they could. It's not the way that anyone probably would have drawn it up, and it was really hard for me. But I really like the person that I am. I like the life that I have. And I'm not for sure whether I have the life that I have in spite of everything that was hard for me, or perhaps because of everything that was hard for me. I'll say that it's sure easy for me to roll with stuff to say, well, it's not that big a deal, because compared to, it's really not that big a deal. So
I think that you help, that the way that you help people is probably because of the life that you had. Because I think that you have such a deep level of empathy of people's experience that if you'd had an easier life, maybe it wouldn't be that easy for you to empathize with all the struggles that people have. I don't know. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% right. And I think it's also easier for me to be courageous, going back to where we started this conversation, courageous and then face really hard stuff, because I've gone through really hard stuff. I mean, think about any epic cartoon movie or whatever, the hero or heroine, whoever he or she is, you got to go in there and fight the dragon, right? And get knocked down and beat up and singed and everything else, right? And you don't learn to be courageous unless you face some stuff that's hard. And courageous, someone just showed me a quote, is John Wayne, right? Courageous is being scared as hell and mounting up anyway.
Yeah.
Say, well, we're just going to go do it.
Yeah. I love that. And I used to tell that to my kids when they were little, that if something's not scary, you don't need to be brave, right? Like, it's like
such an elegant way to phrase that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to borrow that one.
Okay, everyone, listen up to that, right? Get more sleep if you can. Listen to Ned. I know the past few years, I've really tried to prioritize sleep, and I do think it really makes a big difference in our mental health and our outlook. And the days are actually easier if we can get more sleep. And if you still have little ones and you're trying to get them to sleep in their own beds, just remember, you've probably heard me say this, do whatever you can to get the most sleep. You can always change habits later. So just do whatever you can to get the most sleep. Our next guest is another one of my favorite people. Oh my goodness, I'm so lucky, you all. I'm so lucky to have met all of these wonderful people through my work. And of course, all of you. I just really feel blessed. I've been reflecting on 2024 and my life, and especially as my life is going to be changing a lot pretty soon with my daughter growing up and my 2 boys already not living at home anymore. I've really been reflecting on what I want to stay the same, what I want to be different, and what I'm grateful for. And one thing that I think about all the time is all the wonderful people in my life. And if I've had the pleasure of getting to know you at all through my membership or through coaching or just interactions we've maybe had on social media, thank you. I really appreciate everyone's investment in this work that we're all doing together. And I appreciate all of the other people in the space, like Ned, like Sonali, like Vivek, like all the other people that we've heard from so far. And I appreciate them all and appreciate all of you. So the next person that we're going to be talking to is Greg Santucci, who is, as I just mentioned, a wonderful human, but I'm going to say it again. You're going to hear that. He is an occupational therapist, and he has so much wisdom, and he's so good at helping us see things from our child's point of view. Let's hear what Greg has to say for us. Last question before I let you go, which is something I ask all my podcast guests. And the question is, if you were to go back in time to your younger parent self, what would you tell yourself?
We already talked about it. Ignore the noise. We have a real problem with how the pressure that's put on parenting right now from society is really frustrating. That, like, and again, I know something, I still trust mom's gut when they're coming with me. It's just, there's so much noise, and you can take it from all of the young baby parenting advice. I mean, there was a program called My Baby Can Read. And it's like, there's so much pressure on parents that from the time they're 18 months, you're working for a D1 scholarship in some sporting event, or that they have to be potty trained at preschool. Just trust your gut. Trust what your child is telling you through whatever babbling communication, however they are able to communicate with you. That takes precedent over the noise of society, which is not necessarily a great source of information right now. It's a great source of pressure that for parents, we have to, there's a brand new book that I'm reading right now. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. I think it's called Family Unfriendly. And it's starting to talk about how society is so family unfriendly that we're constantly putting pressure. You have to sign up for this. You have to do this. They have to be hitting this milestone at this time. Just know that if they're not, it's okay. And if you have questions, ask those questions to professionals. Don't rely on the pressures of society, because that's broken. So if it's any consolation to the parents who are brave enough to ask questions and speak up, and how much that we heard, like, no, you got it. You're doing it. Let them, like, stay in that space. It is just so less stressful, and therefore you can be more regulated, and then you can offer that regulation to your child. We just went full circle.
I love it. Thank you so much, Greg. Okay, well, you heard it from Greg. You have permission to ignore the noise. If you want to hear the rest of Greg's episode, it was number 157. Another person who gives us permission to ignore the noise of what kids should be doing is Kristen Day. Kristen is a former early childhood education specialist who went rogue and now talks all about play. You can hear Kristen Day in episode 159. And I found her on Instagram, and the thing that caught my eye is a post that she did about why you should not get your kid ready for kindergarten. And I just love that. So if you want to hear the rest of Kristen, as I said, it is episode 159. Let's hear what Kristen has to say to us. But if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, wow. Okay. I would just give myself more permission to just slow down and be present. I think that's what I would tell my younger self. And I think that really actually has a lot to do with just my personality and my drive to build new things and seek out newness. Like, I love change. And like, I started creating the preschool when I was pregnant with my youngest son. So like, I've always just been so like driven to like create the next thing and the next best thing that I forget to like slow down and just enjoy the moment. And I can now make myself slow down and enjoy the moments with my children. But 9 years ago, no, I didn't. It was like a rat race. I think I would also tell myself, your children don't need to be in every single sport and like lesson ever when they're 4.
like they're not going to become a piano prodigy unless they're meant to be a piano prodigy. So like we can just lay off it for a little while, and we don't need to like race from one activity to the next. Just enjoy letting them be little and giving them time to play at home with their siblings or with you or by themselves. So yeah, don't make them be in soccer when they're 3. Don't put them in hockey when they're 3. Like, just let them be kids, because that's like, it's more adult-directed activities. Like, it's not play. It, like, me telling you what to do all the time. And children don't have very much control. And so they do get control over their play when they are able to play. So people are just generally happier when they have time to play.
I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kristen. The thing I love about Slow Down is it's not only good for kids, like Kristen talks about, and that is her area of expertise, right? How children learn and grow and develop in the best possible way. It's good for us as parents to, really let our kids not do so many things and to slow down. It's so good for our family life. I just love that. Next, we're going to hear from Yolanda Williams of Parenting Decolonized. She talks about that fear that we feel and, trying to not be so afraid, which is, I think, where some of our worst parenting decisions come from, is when we are afraid. So let's hear what Yolanda has to say. She was in episode 160, if you want to go back and listen to Yolanda's thoughts on parenting. So if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Younger parent self? Oh, I was 36 when I became a parent. No, I'm playing. I was still young. But I would honestly tell myself that, man, this is actually, I'm sure it's going to be changing, because I was so afraid when Gia was an infant. I was afraid of everything. I thought I was going to kill her constantly. Like my sister bathed her because I was too afraid that I was going to drown her with the water. I did not trust myself. And I would go back and just tell younger 36-year-old me that I can be trusted, that I am not gonna, you're not gonna kill your kid by giving them a bath, that you are capable, that you are worthy, because that was the underpinning thing, is I didn't feel like I was good enough to be the kind of parent that I wanted to be. So I was afraid of everything. And so I would just go back and just tell me that I'm actually a pretty good damn parent, and that you can trust yourself. Like, you are worthy and you are enough, and you don't have to be so afraid all the time.
I love that. Thank you so much, Yolanda. Next up, we have Dr. Joanne Finkelstein, and she's a clinical psychologist, and she wrote a book called Sexism and Sensibility, Raising Empowered, Resilient Girls in the Modern World. Again, we're going to link to these books in the show notes. And if you want to listen to her episode, it was fantastic. Joanne has written a really thoughtful book about confronting some of our internalized sexism that may be present in us, even if we consider ourselves feminists, and present in the way we are raising our children. And I really appreciated her viewpoint. So let's hear what she has to say about her one thing that she would tell herself if she could go back.
So final question, and it's a question I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself? And it can be about anything.
Yeah, I would give myself the advice to not be so self-blaming. I'm a psychologist, and I really believe that nurture has a huge impact. But I didn't value nature as much as I should have. And so my son, who was a really difficult little guy in terms of his temperament and his anxiety and his ability to self-regulate, and he was my first. So I spent a lot of time bashing myself over the head. And I really think that wasn't good for him, because if I had more perspective, I could have dealt with his issues more. And eventually I did, right? I caught on. But I spent a couple of years that I didn't need to, just saying, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with my parenting? I thought I had this thing. I'm a psychologist after all.
That's going to resonate with so many of the people in my community and our listeners, because a lot of people who do turn to studying parenting and listening to parenting books and podcasts often have kids who are probably more like your older son. And if they don't have, a lot of them sometimes end up having another child who's easier. And then they say, oh, it wasn't all about, like, I wasn't doing anything, quote, wrong. It's just that this kid is.
That's what happened.
Yeah. Is that what happened with you? Yeah. This is my first kid was so much more sensitive or spirited or whatever than my second. And so I appreciate that advice to not be so self-blaming and to consider the nature as well as the nurture. Thank you.
Next up is Lynn Lyons. She's one of my favorite people to talk to. I know I keep saying that, but there's so many interesting and wonderful people out there. I'm so lucky to get to talk to them. She's hilarious and so wise. I think not a day goes by in coaching or in my community that I don't rely on something that I've learned from Lynn about anxiety. If you would like to listen to Lynn's episode, this is actually the 4th episode that she's been in. This one, we talked about school anxiety. So if you would like to listen to this episode, it's episode 166, but we will also link to her other episodes in the show notes. Lynn's advice that you're going to hear in a second is especially pertinent for me right now with kids getting older, but it applies for all of us.
And final question, which is a question I ask all my guests, which is, if you could go back to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh, my younger parent self, probably. So my boys are 24 and 26 right now. They just both had birthdays. That they will find their way. They will find their way. And that the best thing that I can do for them is to give them the love and the support. And one thing I did do well, so I'll go back and say to my younger parent self, good job, is to not talk so much. Not talk so much. Listen. Don't step in too quickly. They will find their way. They are still finding their way, my 2 guys. They're still they haven't figured it all out yet.
Well, that's what the 20s are for.
I know. Yeah.
That's such they will find their way is good advice for any age, whether it's your toddler trying to put their jacket on or your teenager struggling in high school or whatever. It's good advice for any age.
It is good advice. And it is so hard not to step in and do it because you know how to do it. And you think,
I used to always say, if everyone in my family would just let me run their lives, they'd be so much happier.
I know. It'd be so true. If you would just listen to me. And that's the hard part of parenting is because we've already done it.
Yeah.
So we do know that if you put your project off to the last minute, you're going to really freak out. We do know that if we know it, and that's not how the brain learns.
No. My oldest son went from when he was blue, like in high school, and me saying like, why don't you get some exercise? To like practically shouting at me, Mom, going for a run doesn't solve everything. To about 5 years later saying, I'm really managing my overwhelm by just stopping what I'm doing and going to the gym when I'm feeling overwhelmed. And I was just like, oh my God.
You're like, oh my God, really? What now? Good for you, buddy. I know. And haven't we all done that so many times, right? So we're the seed planters. We're the seed planters.
Thank you so much.
I just love that from Lynn, especially for me right at this moment. The son in question that I was talking about in that little clip, he's just graduated from college in the summer and he is figuring it out. And I said to my husband and I said to him, I have every confidence that you are going to have a great life. And I think we really need to hold that space. They will find their way. And we need to hold on to that as parents. I love it. Next up is my friend Vivek Patel, and he is another parenting coach. And coincidentally, we've been aware of each other online, but coincidentally, we found out that we live in the same city and we met each other a few months ago in real life for tea. And we took a selfie and we looked at the selfie and hadn't noticed that we were both wearing shirts that said love on the top of them, which we just thought was perfect. I love Vivek. He is a wonderful human being. Definitely check out his work. And he's so inspirational in the world of collaborative parenting and non-coercive parenting, where we're really trying to go with peaceful parenting. So let's hear what Vivek has to say. If you want to listen to his episode, it was episode 168. Well, but before I let you go, the final question that I ask all of my guests, which is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself?
Oh my goodness me. It's a great question. And because it wasn't too long ago that I saw a video of myself interacting with my kid when she was like 5. And I cringed at how I talked to her. Oh my gosh. I cringed because I didn't know I was operating from triggers in those days. I didn't know I had inner child wounds in those days. So I think that probably what I would do is I would say, Vivek, you need to heal yourselves. You've got stuff inside you don't even know is there. I used to say my ideology is clashing with my reality because I had this ideology of how I wanted to parent, but my reality wasn't like that. And so I would say be kinder to yourself. Be willing to look at yourself really honestly and know that you have stuff in there that needs cleaning out. If I had known that earlier and if I had changed some of those things earlier, I think our earliers were so chaotic because we didn't know what the hell we were doing and all this stuff just popped up.
Well, thanks, Vivek, for being such a champion of children. That's what I always think of my job as being a champion of children through working with their parents, helping them see a different way of relating and being together. So true. Lovely words from Vivek. It reminds me of something that parents often say to me when we're in our second or third session of coaching together, where they say, oh my gosh, this isn't even really about my kids. This is just about me. So I love Vivek's idea to heal yourself and look at yourself honestly, because so much of this is it's not about what our children do, but it's about our response to what they do and what we're bringing to the table. Next up, we have Lucy and Alexis, who came to us from BANA, Ontario, which is the Bulimia Anorexia Nervosa Association. And that was a really great episode in terms of raising kids who aren't going to have a problem with disordered eating or unhealthy body images. That was episode 170. If you want to hear more about that, here are Lucy and Alexis and their takes. Well, thank you both so much. I'm just going to close out by asking you the question that I ask all my podcast guests, which is, if you could go back in time, and it doesn't have it can have nothing to do with what we've been talking about. This is just your view as a parent. But if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself? Be less anxious. With my newborn, I wish I had just not felt so tied to the house. I think when you have one, obviously that changes when you have multiple kids, but I wish I hadn't had to rush home to feed him, or I could have actually just stayed out, and just be less anxious, go with the flow a little bit more. It'll be okay. I probably could have used that. Nice.
Yeah, I think for myself, it would be feel less guilty. I think there's a lot of guilt to parenting, and especially working full time. I think there's a lot of expectations, and I feel like lately I've just been letting it go, and I don't want to feel the guilt. And I feel like I'm role modeling something great for my kids, that you can work full time, you can be successful, and you can be present with them as well. And so feeling less guilty of sharing your time and then being present when you can in whatever capacity. I think that's for me what I've been working on.
Love that. Thank you both so much for your time today. Be less anxious and feel less guilty. I know those are two things that are easier said than done, but it's always good to have a reminder to try not to feel anxious and to try not to feel guilty, and remind yourselves that you are worthy and lovable, even when things go sideways. We are down to our last two guests. We've got Kim Hawley, second to last here, to round out our mashup. Kim is a holistic sleep coach, and she talked to us about sleep needs and from the newborn to age 3 set. And she shared something that I think all of us can relate to. Here's Kim. Okay, last question before we let you go is, if you could go back in time to your younger parent self, what advice would you give yourself? It can have to do with anything parenting. How about not to care so much what other parents think? Probably most people don't know my work, but also don't know that I'm blind. And it used to make me so nervous, dressing my son to go out, he had to have everything matching perfectly, because they're there's that blind mom who can't trust her son, right? And then he went to preschool at 2.5, this really lovely, like, Jewish half-day co-op preschool. And I loved his preschool teacher. She goes, Kim, do you know how many of these toddlers walk in here, like, wearing God knows whatever crazy shenanigans because they dress themselves?
And you couldn't see it. You didn't know.
I couldn't see it. Right. And Ian, my oldest, he had no interest in dressing himself. He was not that kid. My daughter, totally, yes. But he's not dressing himself. She's like, they don't know that. It does not matter if he's wearing mismatching socks and his velvet kid. Doesn't matter.
It must have been so much work for you, Kim, to try and figure out a system to have your child's clothes match.
We had lots of basics. Like, no one was allowed to buy me clothes that weren't, like, neutral pants and, like, top. So, like, everything had to match. It was, like,
Right.
it was so one thing I was like, no one gets to deviate from my requests on this one because I was working, like, for much of his I was working part-time. I was home with him. And so I was the one getting him dressed. I'm like, no one's making my life more difficult. But I like that's just like one example. I think I think a lot of moms are probably like this, but just too aware of what other people were thinking. He's also much more, as a kiddo, more explosive, more persistent, neurodivergent kiddo. And so sitting on the sidewalk while your toddler / preschooler / early elementary school kid has a complete meltdown and people are just walking by, like, and you're just like, just gonna sit here.
Right.
Keep my kids safe and just totally block the sidewalk in the middle of DC. This is fine. And everyone's judging me.
Well, but I think that's good advice is try not to care what other people think. And we always say, and I know you know this in peaceful parenting, is your loyalty is with your child and not what the other people around you are thinking. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
The thing I love about these pieces of advice from our guests is even when they're really specific, like Kim's, the vibe is so universal for all of us. Like, who hasn't been worried that other people are judging you? I think we've all been there. And it's so great to feel that you're not alone in this hard sometimes, wonderful sometimes parenting journey. If you want to hear Kim's episode, that was episode 172. Next up, last but not least, we have Jennifer Wallace, and she wrote a book called Never Enough: The Toxic Effects of Achievement Culture, which was really great because we've heard a couple people talk about peer pressure and slowing down and not feeling like you have to do everything. And Jennifer's book really presents the science behind it and all the research behind why we need to make kids feel like they matter more than we need to make sure that they are successful in all of the sort of traditional achievement markers. Let's hear what Jenny has to say. Last question I'll ask you that I ask all my guests. If you could go back in time to your younger mother self, what advice would you give yourself? It doesn't have to be about this. It can be about anything.
Oh, I know the number one advice I would give myself is don't listen to the wider culture. Prioritize yourself and your resilience as a mother, your support system, because your children's resilience is going to rest on your resilience. So fight those messages to be everything and everyone and run yourself ragged, and instead be countercultural, build up your resilience so that you can be that first responder that you need to be for your kids' struggles.
Love that.
So prioritize your relationship.
Yeah. I love how her words just really dovetail into peaceful parenting and our peaceful parenting approach. So great. And Jenny's episode was number 173, if you want to listen to it. And that was it, people. That was it. Those are like, what an amazing collection of wise words and wise people that I got the privilege of talking to this year. I didn't include every single one. We'd be here all day, but those were some of my favorites. If you have any ideas for who you would like to come on the podcast, drop me a line, send me a DM, and let me know a great guest expert that you think our peaceful parenting community needs to hear from. If you would like to come on the podcast as a parent who needs coaching, also drop me a line. And if you have any ideas for what I should ask my daughter, Maxine, when I interview her about being raised with peaceful parenting, I am all ears. Have a wonderful remainder of 2024, and we will see you in 2025 with a new season of the Peaceful Parenting Podcast.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. I hope you found this conversation insightful and exactly what you needed in this moment. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Remember that I'm rooting for you. I see you out there showing up for your kids and doing the best you can. Sending hugs over the airwaves today. Hang in there. You've got this.